Hello everyone, welcome to the last class of the semester. It is only fitting that we should end with disease and violence, and that is exactly what we're going to talk about today. The other title that I have for this lecture is Why You Should Be Glad You Missed the 14th Century. The first reason you should be glad you missed the 14th century is the very beginning of the 14th century, in which there was a very serious famine. The population of Europe had increased 300% since 1000, so there were many more people in Europe than there had been before. You might remember that the farming techniques and the better weather had helped the food supply grow, which had helped the population grow. But in 1300, a cycle of famine began, ending with, in 1309, a disaster of continental proportions. So there really was simply not enough to eat for everyone. This may have happened because of climate. The climate may have gotten colder. The pack ice increases starting about 1250, and the summers got shorter. We know that from several different sources, commentary and written sources from the period, but also examination of core samples of the pack ice at the poles, and what's called dendrochronology, that is looking at the rings of trees. For a long time, historians blamed the Mongols, who were on the move in Asia, for the advent of the plague. It is unlikely that the Mongols were responsible for the movement of plague from east to west, even though they may have suffered from it. The newest theories have it coming west on the trade routes via the grain trade. Okay, so look at the population numbers here. And you will see that in 1300 we're just shy of 80 million people in Europe. And then you can see the drop to about 60 million in 1400. That's the loss of circa 20 million people. You can compare it to the 40 million people who died in the 1918 flu epidemic. And of course, we are still living in a COVID atmosphere now. So the plague arrived in Italy in 1347 via a ship. And immediately people in the town began to become ill. Apparently the rats in the ship were infested with the kind of flea that you need in order to get bubonic plague, and people began to get sick. It was confusing and frightening for them from the beginning, simply because, for one thing, diseases are scary, as we all are in the right position to know. But also because the plague, as it presented, looked like a number of different sicknesses, not just one sickness. Bubonic plague, which is what we sort of call the entire range of symptoms, refers to a swelling in the lymph nodes, either in the groin, the armpits, or in the neck, which are called buboes. That's why it's called bubonic plague. Bubonic plague has about a 60% death rate in the absence of any native immunity. Pneumonic plague, which is where the bacterium settles in your lungs, has a death rate of 90 to 95%. And if it happens in the blood, septicemic, everybody dies with that, and within 24 hours. So what they had was a disease that looked like big lumping and lumps and swelling in the body. They had people coughing and sneezing, and they had people falling down and never getting back up again. Now, as we have talked about, and you've talked about a little the humoral theory of medicines, the humoral theory was not in a position to do anything about a disease of this magnitude. Medieval people tried a number of remedies. They tried to smell good smells. You remember, smell is contagion as far as they're concerned. To keep near fires, because they believed that the fire would keep them safe. And in fact, if they did this completely, then the virus would not have, the bacterium cannot survive in a hot climate. And of course, there are charms and amulets and potions, of all descriptions. One of the nastiest to my mind is the use of human urine as a draft or a drink. So as you saw on the chart, population was reduced by 1/3 to 1/2 by 1351. This is in Western Europe. And it becomes a pandemic. That is, it pops back up again about every 20 years or so till the 17th century. And there's a particularly bad one in England in 1666, which is the Great Plague of London, a very, very bad outbreak of it there. Everyone in medieval Europe was baffled about where it came from. The scientists at the universities opined that it had something to do with the movement of the planets in outer space. Everyone else was convinced that either that God was very angry with them or that they needed to change their ways. Okay. So the God is punishing us explanation was current all over Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Ancient peoples in general, medieval people also, were quick to connect divine prejudice with disease. Okay. So we're going to talk about your reading in class. You're going to see some of the reactions that I'm talking about now in the Boccaccio reading that you have for class. The who cares reaction, the penitent reaction, and then the blame game. I want to talk a little bit about the flagellants, who are a group of people in Northern Europe who are of the opinion that the plague is coming because of God's anger at the people. And so they would go on these processions. You would have people get together in a parade, and the parade lasted 33 days, as long as Jesus had been alive in years. And they would march from town to town, and when they got to a town square, the men would disrobe to the waist, and they would whip themselves, loudly praying for God to have mercy on them. They stirred up a lot of panic and despair in Northern Europe, and one of the outcomes of that was a wave of anti-Semitism, which led to the deaths of many Jews. And unfortunately, we've seen the blame game against Jews several times this semester, and it doesn't stop. It was also possible, of course, to blame the church. Now think a minute about what was going on in the 14th century in the church, which we talked about last time. The church was in crisis. It was very serious. So for some people, the Avignon papacy and then having 2 popes and then 3 popes was good evidence that God was turning away from the church and turning his anger on the people. When the plague was over, a good portion of the workforce had been killed. And for a while, the new demand for workers, because there were so many people who were dead, meant higher wages for people who worked for wages. It was also easier for serfs to run away because they could always find paid work someplace else. So if they were courageous enough and unattached enough to run, they could do that in this period. Then when governments began to crack down and began to not allow the wages to rise the way that the workers felt that they should, they had revolts. The first one happens in 1358, just 7 years after the end of the plague. It's called the Jacquerie. The Jacquerie is named for the leather garments that the people wore. They were called Jacques. So these are the people that wear leather aprons, that is, working people. They rose up in France in 1358, captured a couple of castles, did really terrible things to the people that lived in those castles, declared themselves free. Fairly quickly, the King of France sent out a professional army, and it crushed the revolt. This was only the first of a number of different revolts around Europe. In 1378, in Italy, factory workers called the Ciompi, and Ciompi are the wooden shoes that they wore so they could keep their feet dry while they were working. These were textile workers. They found that the wages that they were being paid did not allow for them to get enough money for food, so they revolted, and eventually they got some concessions from the government in terms of wages so that they would go back to work. So this was almost like a strike in Italy in 1378, but there were some public rioting as well. The most famous of these, arguably, is the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. A group of serfs from the countryside rose up against their overlords and marched towards London, intent upon getting the freedom and their rights from King Richard II. King Richard II was a teenager at the time. He was a rather weak king, but the peasants were convinced that if they could just talk to the king, then they could make him understand what their demands were, and he would make everything better. So they marched on London. The people of London were terrified. They thought that the entire city was going to get burned down. They did burn down a few things, and King Richard finally decided that he would go out and meet with them. So there was a meeting out in a field between the king sitting on horseback and the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt. And the way the story gets told is that somebody made a wrong move. Maybe one of the ringleaders made a movement towards the king or uttered a threat or something, but the entire meeting devolved into violence. The king managed to escape, but at that point the rioting became endemic and large portions of London were damaged. This all sounds pretty terrible, and you should be glad that you missed it. But the result of these uprisings and the result of the new demand for workers, meaning higher wages, meant that serfdom began to disappear in Western Europe. So serfdom by the end of the 15th century is entirely gone in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, that's not true, but serfdom is gone in the West. Now, the other thing we're going to do in class is we're going to wrap up this semester. So come with some ideas about what our overarching themes have been this semester.